Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US-based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. And every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Always glad to be here.
You're welcome. Welcome once again. Several big topics again this time too. So first, let's touch upon the India-US trade deal. How do you look at that from that part of the world, Irina?
Well, let's not forget that this deal has been in the works for some time, and to be honest, I'm not sure whether it would have ever come to fruition had it not been for the earlier pact between the European Union and India that apparently got some people in the Trump administration pretty envious of the successful outcome because just a week later, instantaneously, this long-standing, complicated deal all of a sudden was announced. Now, it's being framed by both governments as an interim political breakthrough. The idea is to reset tariff tensions and to open the door to a more comprehensive later bilateral trade agreement. So the story is not yet over. What is publicly known so far is that it's structured in phases. It's starting with tariff recalibration, and it's to be followed by longer term negotiations on regulatory barriers, on digital trade, on investment screening, and also on strategic supply chains. So, this reflects that tariff relief is basically just faster and easier to implement, whereas all these other regulatory and structural reforms they require a lot more negotiation and a deeper bureaucratic alignment. Now, both sides have prioritized speed in announcing the framework, even though the details of the legal implementation schedule and all the annexes and all the details they're still being finalized. So what we're hearing is that the point of this early announcement is to signal confidence, to reassure exporters and investors that the trade relationship is no longer on an escalation path. The interim nature of this agreement means that how durable it is will ultimately depend on how the subsequent chapters of this diplomatic debacle are actually implemented, whether the language is going to be binding, what terminology is used. But the most immediate and concrete result of what we know so far is that it does reduce US tariffs on a wide range of Indian exports. For several years now, Indian exporters faced elevated duties that reduced price competitiveness on a wide range of products, including textiles, engineering goods, chemicals, and other manufacturing commodities. So, this new tariff structure is lowering the burden for them, and it's also supposed to restore a predictable access to the US market, and it makes a huge economic difference because US is still one of India's largest export destinations, especially for high value manufactured goods and services. So what we're seeing is small and medium exporters from India are going to benefit greatly, and they were the ones who were mostly absorbing the margin compression. And from Washington's perspective, the reduction is also supposed to be reciprocal. So it's tied to Indian commitments in other areas. So it's not being seen as a unilateral concession either. Very important from Donald Trump's perspective, especially.
Absolutely, Irina. So, what happened suddenly? Means, even though the discussions were on since a long time, and even though amidst those discussions also new tariffs came in, if I understand, what brought this change of heart on, especially on Mr. Trump's side? Suddenly, was it the India EU deal, or was it any other factor? All the Russian factor, did they get meat, or anything else got met in this whole pressure tactics, if I may use it, from the US president's side?
I think it's certainly helpful the fact that India is being seen as reducing its dependence on Russian oil and turning more to other markets such as the Gulf. But I don't think that was ultimately the decisive factor. I think whoever was arguing for a quick resolution certainly used it as an argument. But I do think that for Trump personally, on a gut level, it was the appearance that somebody else was getting away with a win that he was not getting a part of that really made the difference. I really do think that is how he perceived what happened. I'm not sure whether EU and India really intended it that way. To be frank, I think they were more concerned about their own interests under US pressure. They I don't think they necessarily thought that it would rush US back to the table, but it certainly, I think, had exactly that impact.
Absolutely. How do you think, Russia would look at this particular change? Recently, there was the Russian president visit also. Also from China's side, there was a
Mhm.
whole new equation coming up between India and China too.
I don't think either country is going to be particularly pleased that there is a reduction in tariffs, especially a bilateral agreement, because they view this not only as a simple economic agreement, but as a political issue that was creating a rift and affecting security issues as well. And they were hoping that the crisis would continue and maybe even escalate. So the fact that the countries are now trying to resolve their differences in a much more constructive way and that the trade is going to return to some semblance of normalcy is certainly against their interest. Russia simply does not want US to make any inroads in the Indian markets. It's They're competing for the same markets in many areas, first of all, and second, they also view it as political obstacle, and for China too, that could complicate issues because with the reopening of the US market, India has less pressure to try to compensate elsewhere, and China has not been its primary target for a good reason. There's a great deal of distrust. It's a complicated to reabsorb Chinese companies, and any excuse not to have to rush with that process and not to have to make concessions it doesn't need to make will be, that's something that New Delhi is definitely taking into consideration.
Absolutely. From your understanding, Irina, who is the bigger winner in terms of the details of the trade deal?
Right now, it's hard to say because they're so scarce. From the looks of it, any reciprocal reduction in tariffs benefits both sides equally, in my opinion. The rest will depend on the implementation and the specific details. For now, I would say it's a win win simply because it creates an opening for further discussions and eliminates this political tension that was also undercutting other aspects of the relationship, including the Indo-Pacific security partnership, and I think that's an important piece. I think while both countries, I would say for now, are equal winners, I think China and Russia are the losers in this equation.
Right, right. Are there anything that could be deal breakers of this particular, temporary deal, if we may call it, or do you think it is going to be a permanent deal now from going forward?
I would not rule out the fact that Trump at any point can change his mind for any reason. And it could be simply to try to ratchet up concessions from the other side as a negotiating tactic. It could be because he is angry about something unrelated. It could be because Elon Musk, who's having problems getting into the Indian markets, asked him for to, or it could be simply if he and Russia come to some separate understanding, or he and China come to some separate understanding, that could affect matters. For now, it's wise to take this issue one day at a time and hope for the best, because it's in both countries' interest to make this work out. There is a lot to be gained from expanding the markets, from integrating capacities. For India, it's a great way to get superior technical products. For US, it's a great way to enter a very big and growing market in a very vibrant economy. So both sides tend to gain from resolving the differences in as many of them as possible, rather than looking for obstacles and snags.
Absolutely, Irina. Any particular pitfalls for India to fulfill conditions of this deal at any point in time, though the details are scarce, if any, you can see.
In terms of pitfalls, so far we know that India has expressed a large multi-year intention to expand imports of US energy, including crude oil, LNG, and possibly coal and related energy products. So, of course, if the prices on those products change, or if ultimately the US decides to play games with the supply, that could, dependency on any one country in energy is always dangerous. US energy is not the cheapest, and moreover, if at some later point Trump decides to change his tariff policy on other products, that could also affect the affordability of these energy prices. So the biggest pitfall is Trump himself and his unpredictability and his unwillingness to keep by his prior commitments. Even now, he's considering, for instance, withdrawing from the trilateral with Canada and Mexico that he himself concluded during his first term. So it's not out of the question that he could change his mind, and that could make a long-term commitment for India potentially more expensive unless they lock in the rates in a way that makes it impossible for US to raise prices or to make things more difficult, and to tie this multi-year agreement to other tariff reduction concerns, and essentially leave an opening to withdraw if the prices end up being affected by any additional new tariffs. You know, that would be, in my opinion, from a legal perspective, a way to counter these potential unpredictable moments, to make the agreement, locked in longer term agreement, conditional on US keeping to the agreed upon terms.
Absolutely, Irina. One last question on this is that, India has been very active, especially in the last 1 year. Though it's, on the foreign affairs side, things have been very active. But in the last 1 year, especially with regards to the India EU deal and the visit, Russian president's visit, and the Indian Prime Minister's visit in several places also, and the way things have been, being managed. How do you see this whole new deal with the India EU thing and the US? How would the world be looking at India managing its affairs, much more strongly? How would you look at it?
I mean, in my opinion, I think this is a great way to diversify supply of energy and other products, and to become less dependent on any one any one supplier. But it's also a great way to build up a more pro-Western oriented front, because in my opinion, ultimately that will be the winning side. Yes, you could say that Western countries squabble a lot, and they are currently experiencing tensions over various things, but their economies are strong and vibrant and have a much longer term better potential than authoritarian regimes of any type. And they are the least likely to come under sanctions, and they're the most stable and shielded from risk. So I think ultimately, from a purely business risk perspective, these are the safer relationships to pursue in the longer term, even if Russia and China offer short-term advantages for a growing economy.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Now let's move on. Talking of India only, let's move on to another topic, that is Arab League visit to India and also the upcoming India GCC free trade pact. Help us understand about, for the international audience also, what this Arab League is all about, what this visit mean for India and for them.
In the last few years, India has moved from very occasional engagement with the Middle Eastern countries to a much more sustained and multi-channel diplomacy on a wide variety of major priority issues, including energy security, trade, diaspora protection, and also maritime stability. Also, the fact that India has been rapidly rising as an economy created more, a much greater interest in Arab capitals because they are themselves trying to diversify beyond hydrocarbons and looking for durable demand for investment partners and also for skilled labor linkages. So, as a collective platform, the Arab League matters because it can translate these bilateral relationships into a region-wide signal on issues that affect multiple countries and relationships, such as corridor connectivity, port access, food security coordination, and even counterterrorism cooperation potentially. India can use such multilateral engagements to consolidate a narrative of multi alignment that allows it to keep different channels open, even as within those regions, different rival blocs are experiencing tensions, while it can continue to emphasize non interference and economic pragmatism. For Arab states, building up stronger relationships with India also reduces over dependence on any single external partner, and it gives them greater and more diverse options for technology, for education, for healthcare, and even industrial collaboration. So this visit is less about optics and photo ops and ceremonies and more about formalizing the fact that India is a growing factor in collective Arab diplomacy, and the timing of this is particularly significant because India's Gulf relationship is already one of its most operationally diverse and vibrant foreign policy portfolios. Gulf supplies are a very large share of India's crude oil and LNG supplies, and meanwhile, India in return supplies services, construction expertise, and a workforce that is embedded in nearly every sector of Gulf economies, and that's not something to be forgotten. Remittances, labor mobility frameworks, and even consular protection are now turning into permanent bureaucratic agendas rather than simply issues of occasional crisis response. And also, there's an expanding security coordination factor um, because the Gulf states are now dealing with transnational financing networks, with extremist recruitment pipelines, and also with the same maritime threats in the Red Sea, in the Indian Oceans. They are affecting insurance premiums and shipping schedules, and all of these are practical logistical issues that need to be dealt with jointly. India's naval presence in the Arabian Sea, also its recent participation in anti-piracy operation, is also giving these leaders a practical reason to see India not only as simply a trade partner but also as a stabilizing stakeholder. So this engagement is helping create this multi-layered messaging that until recently remained fragmented among very different bilateral tracks with different countries.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, and surprisingly, you see, Arab League's visit to India, a lot of engagement happening. But our neighbors in Pakistan still are dealing with, those so-called terrorist attacks and all those things, security measures. The oil promised by Trump is yet to happen. I wonder what is happening in that part of the world, very close to our neighborhood. Why aren't all these big visits also happening for them? There is a much more natural, relationship with the Arab countries there. Help us understand what's happening in Pakistan. Where do we see that part of the world getting a bit more, development oriented and not those attacks and all those things?
Well, in fact, Pakistan has been making some economic progress in terms of startups, especially among younger and more educated, Western educated people. And in fact, from an economic perspective, it has risen significantly in the agenda of the Gulf states in particular, not to mention, of course, China and Central Asian countries, which view it as an important node and and economic corridor, logistical corridor. However, internal security issues are complicating the move from bilateral discussions and planned projects to implementation and more multilateral and high profile engagement. Um, this terrorist attacks, which was ISIS took credit for it, this was not the only security incident in the last weeks. We have seen escalation in conflict with the Baluchi uprising. On the one hand, there's a great deal of informal smuggling and criminal networks operating in the area. On the other hand, there are autonomy and independence movement related uprisings related to uh, 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 cultural and recognition demands and a feeling of oppression from the state authorities. Um, there's also an alignment between Baluchi organizations and other networks and power struggles operating within the country. And even the ISIS attack, that was quite deadly, was not the first or last of its kind. It comes after a period of tensions, period of other smaller scale attacks in the last few weeks, and an attempted negotiation with the Afghani Taliban, which has also been infiltrating into Pakistan and joining other groups, including the Pakistani Taliban, in launching attacks. Now, whether or not ISIS is actually operating in isolation, or whether it's a combination of the broader growth of extremism and in, interlocking planning and reinforcement of different extremist networks of one another's agenda, it's a question that needs to be looked at more closely. In my opinion, while Pakistan is increasingly viewed as a strategically valuable actor by some countries, these internal fragmentations undercut its value and will make any external policy frameworks ultimately untenable, because if the country is torn apart by extremism and violence, it cannot devote the resources that are necessary to sustain external commitments. And we have seen over the past few weeks, since after the conclusion of the defense pact, formal defense pact with Saudi Arabia a few months ago, that Pakistan has been concluding a wide range of defense agreements with various countries: Sudan, Oman, Egypt, Morocco, and others. It's potentially Turkey could also enter into the trilateral pact with Saudi and Pakistan in the region. All of these things create credibility on the one hand, but also put pressure on the other. To have a vibrant and credible defense sector, you also need to have a stable economy, and you have to have an ability to actually produce what you are selling, the arms you are selling, without being essentially distracted by terrorists. I'm not entirely sure that that is something that Pakistan is capable of, and I think that the countries engaging in these defense agreements are undertaking a very high risk. A government that is basically governed by corrupt military juntas cannot be relied upon to carry out those orders in a timely manner, especially when also dealing with internal crisis. I think they're going to be a huge distraction from the production schedule, and that's just a very basic logistical point, saying nothing of the issue of who ends up being ultimately in power if things continue in that direction. As for the Pakistani oil, that I think has been largely an excuse for other things and agreements. I think Trump has been trying to bring Pakistan into the Gaza peace board and into Gaza peacekeeping force. So far, that hasn't occurred. But what has happened is that the Trump administration seems to be looking for critical minerals in North Waziristan, of all places. And that I find the most curious aspect of this situation, because, first of all, that is a very unstable area. Um, and I would say it's one of the most volatile territories in South Asia, and it's been long associated with terrorist networks, with cross-border insurgent flows, and a very complex tribal structure that has traditionally resisted centralized control across different governments. Even after large-scale Pakistani military operations aimed at clearing sanctuaries for these people, it's extremely sensitive. From a security standpoint, it remains extremely vulnerable and risky. And introducing foreign-linked mineral exploration into such an environment would not be a routine commercial exercise. It would need a great deal more of security resources, and there would be a great deal more of a risk of becoming entangled in local power dynamics. And any mistake made could turn into a huge security flashpoint. I mean, critical minerals are important because they underpin supply chains for semiconductors, for batteries, for defense systems, for renewable energy technologies, and for any advanced manufacturing, even construction and automotives. And we are seeing that and AI companies and defense companies, they're all increasingly under pressure to produce more, faster, and better, and in a way that cannot be easily disrupted by China or by terrorists and so forth. But mineral extraction in fragile zones requires stable property rights, transparent licensing, environmental safeguards, and reliable infrastructure. And Northern Waziristan is not just a place for any of these conditions. Just because it may have minerals there does not mean that it's a commercially viable or politically sustainable production process. I think it's a little bit of a pipe dream at this point.
Absolutely, absolutely. Little bit of pipe dream at this point in time. We'll have to watch out, but we, as you said, pipe dream as well. Lots of slippery ground there. But let be that as it may. Let's move on to U.S. Iran diplomacy. Are they friends? Are they diplomatic friends? What is happening? Sometimes there is warning. Sometimes there is friendship. It's very confusing from this part of the world, Irina. What's happening? Will they become friends or will they become enemies from here on?
So the issues on the table are several, and the level of disparity between two sides is such that they cannot even agree on the scope of negotiations. Iran wants to focus almost exclusively on the nuclear file. US wants to address other issues, including, first and foremost, ballistic missiles, and of course, the use of proxies and terrorist groups in destabilizing local trade routes and neighboring countries. The fact is, Trump in recent days has repeatedly threatened Iran with additional attacks in the event these talks fail. Iran, for its part, signaled its readiness for the talks to fail and is apparently preparing its nuclear facilities for defensive posture against any potential strikes. I don't think Iran is seriously expecting these talks to succeed. I think it's buying time because it understands that Trump wants to avoid an escalation or confrontation as much as possible, but they also understand that they cannot agree and give US what it's demanding, because it would be literally a complete collapse of their ideological posture, which may be the only element still sustaining the remnants of whatever support they have in their own bureaucratic ranks. So at this point, it is an existential issue for them, not because somebody is attacking them and threatening to kill them, but on the contrary, because they themselves may collapse under the weight of their own political disillusionment with the extreme promises that have been given and these commitments to this ideological course that are now under pressure from outside forces, in this case being the United States. We have seen that Prime Minister Netanyahu visited Trump earlier today. The outcome of that, in terms of the Iran issue specifically, was that Trump said that he still prefers diplomacy to war. But we have seen the risk of extensive negotiations where there's no clear line towards a breakthrough. And Iran benefits from any prolonged, time being spent. So does Russia, which uses this time to kind of learn the patterns of these negotiations and to adjust its own attack schedules on Ukraine to divert attention. It benefits from US resources being spread out for weeks at a time without any clear progress, and the sense of anticipation and attrition and commitment to multiple theaters simultaneously without being able to make a breakthrough in either case. So all of that has a long-term cost for the US, and the more time it spends, the more credibility it loses after making dramatic promises of assistance which have not materialized into anything substantive, as far as I can see. And even if there are some, I don't know, cyber disruptions or economic pressure points that US is implementing, they have not had any publicly visible effect that would matter from a deterrence or information warfare standpoint. And so far, the signaling are all that US is that US is waiting for Iran, that Iran is getting the freedom to set its condition, and US is at least in public deferring to the regime's demands. That is a very dangerous signal to send if you're trying to deter a country that has also revealed itself to be somewhat of a paper tiger after last year's operations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very confusing state of affairs there. But maybe President Trump is a very charismatic man. He must be having many cards still up his, Trump cards up his sleeves. That we'll have to see. But what about Israel? Steve Witkoff visits Israel, Netanyahu to return to Washington to discuss Iran. What will he discuss here when US and Iran themselves are not able to discuss? What will he gain out of this?
So, actually, the reason Netanyahu came to the US is in part because of that visit. In fact, Netanyahu and his advisors got scared by the depth of Witkoff's ignorance and apparent incompetence on this issue, and that prompted them to try to get to Trump directly and to try to negotiate with other members of the team and to make their message more clear and more urgent, because Witkoff did not seem to be understanding Israel's concerns, and the concerns were not just about Iran's posture. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It doesn't need a lot of explaining, but they're concerned about the signals that US is putting out through the likes of Witkoff and Kushner, and I think that was that is why Netanyahu is actually returning after less than 2 months, after just a little over a month since his last visit to deal with the same topic in late December. Witkoff, during his visit, was supposed to coordinate positions ahead of this US-Iran diplomatic engagement and to assess Israel's updated intelligence picture regarding Iran's nuclear progress and regional objectives. And as we see from satellites imagery that has been revealed since his visit in the last few days, there's been continuing movement and progress, and Iran has been making its intentions very clear. He talked about breakout timelines, missile development, and proxy activity in several countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and of course about the credibility of deterrent signaling. It was not supposed to be a mere symbolic visit, and Unfortunately, it produced more questions than answers, and that is why Netanyahu ended up being where he was on a short notice. Um, the goal was to ensure that any subsequent engagement between Washington and Tehran would not surprise Jerusalem operationally or politically, but in fact, that's exactly what happened. Netanyahu signaled that he is extremely concerned that Israel would be outflanked by other concerns. The fact that the ballistic missile issue, in particular, was not being brought up was a particular uh, concern. So before the big meeting with Trump earlier today, Netanyahu additionally had preparatory discussions with the same Witkov and Jared Kushner. Um, they talked about not just Iran but also Gaza, general stabilization of the region, and broader regional concerns and architecture. And um, they talked about trying to align tactical diplomacy with strategic deterrence. Netanyahu sought clarity on the scope and uh, basically the substance of US-Iran negotiations, particularly with regard to the ballistic missile issue and also process networks, and whether they would be addressed alongside the nuclear enrichment constraints. The Israeli leadership would emphasize that a narrow nuclear framework without enforcement against Iran's regional activity would be strategically incomplete and would leave Israel open to attacks. The US side stressed the importance of diplomatic channels remaining open while maintaining pressure mechanisms. Netanyahu also met with Secretary Rubio. He formally signed on to the Gaza Board of Peace, to which he pledged to join. Um, uh, and he's looking to be inside of that framework to see if Israel can have any influence on the way, on the direction it's taking, um, and to also engage in structured post-war planning under U.S. leadership. However, the board's composition and authority remain controversial and not fully aligned with everyone as of yet. The whole approach is a shift in mm, uh, in the way Washington is handling post-conflict governance. Previously, U.S. relied almost exclusively on traditional multilateral mechanisms, including, of course, the UN framework, but now US is opting for more centralized structure under direct political sponsorship, and much of the participation by other leaders such as Gulf states depends on credible assurances that reconstruction in Gaza will not empower Hamas or lead to renewed instability. From a security standpoint, the fact that Israel decided to join strengthens its legitimacy, but it also ties Netanyahu's government to implementation outcomes. So it's a risk for him politically. The first formal session is scheduled on February 19th, which means it's going to be a practical policy commitment and not just a rhetorical gesture, especially since Indonesia now announced its intention to commit up to 8,000 troops for stabilization forces inside Gaza. Now, Netanyahu's meeting with Trump centered almost exclusively on Iran. Trump, as I said, mentioned that he prefers diplomacy, but he did underscore that negotiations must produce enforceable limits and clear verification standards. Netanyahu, for his part, pressed for a negotiating scope beyond uranium enrichment caps to include ballistic missile developments and Iran's regional proxy commitments. The Israeli position remains that a nuclear deal that's focused exclusively on that one issue leaves structural destabilization mechanisms untouched and creates assorted other and potentially even greater threats. Trump did not announce that there was a breakthrough between the two sides, but he described the meeting as productive and strategically aligned. Both sides agreed that deterrence should be emphasized while leaving room for continued talks with Tehran. And of course, part of the undercurrent of this discussion was Gulf pressure to not attack Iran. These countries have repeatedly conveyed to Washington their concern that escalation between Israel and Iran would place their territory and infrastructure at immediate risk. And that would include energy facilities, desalination plants, financial hubs, and shipping lanes, potentially highly exposed in any confrontation scenario. And they advocated for a posture of firm deterrence combined with diplomatic containment. They supported strict nuclear monitoring but opposed any kinetic escalation that could destabilize regional trade and investment flows. And that pressure ultimately influenced Washington's position as well, since U.S. bases in the Gulf would also become targets in a major confrontation, and also because several countries are refusing to allow U.S. to use their airspace, which narrows U.S. options in any scenario. And Iran watching this meeting is it interprets any high-profile U.S.-Israel coordination as potential prelude to action. So the Iranian leadership looking at these summits, it looks for signals of joint planning or red line articulation. So if Tehran perceives at what it interprets as tightening coordination, it may adjust enrichment pace or regional proxy signaling to raise deterrence costs. On the other hand, if it believes that the Gulf influence is prevailing and restraining Washington, it may test diplomatic boundaries incrementally. So, judging but what we saw today, uh, there does not appear to be any specific red line talk yet, at least not from Trump. This is something that Netanyahu was also pushing for, but failed to produce with this visit. But that also means that Iran may look and see that there is a daylight between the two countries on a potential kinetic escalation, and that it can afford to kind of engage in diplomacy for some time before being cornered into making a clear position on its direction and having to live with the consequences. So it has this visit, the signals from this visit rather bought Iran some time, as Tehran is likely to read it.
Absolutely, Irina. And very quickly, what's happening with the Russia-Ukraine talks? Going nowhere, and again, is it a failure because one particular side doesn't want to have peace, and especially with this June deadline and all this simple waste of time when hundreds of people are dying every day, doesn't look like to be the urgency that is required to deal with such a thing.
No, this is obviously, yet another iteration of diplomacy after multiple stalled and collapsed diplomatic efforts, which ranged from early war contacts in Belarus and Turkey and Saudi Arabia to various intermittent back channels exchanges facilitated by intelligence services and assorted third party straits. Um, so we already see that this war has hardened into a protracted conflict with entrenched front lines, layered sanctions, and expanding external military assistance. UAE decided to take on this hosting obligation due to its capacity of maintaining working relationships with both Moscow and Kiev while avoiding avert alignment with Western sanction policy or um, Russia or taking on Russian war narratives over in a very active way. They have echoed a lot of some of the language, but they have also not been the frontline state in defending all of this the way, for instance, China, Iran, and North Korea, Russia's closest allies, have been. So it's been seen as a relatively neutral area, at least for technical dialogue, even in the absence of political trust, which is very clear. So we have seen literally years of partial engagement, prisoner exchanges, humanitarian coordination, and repeated failures to bridge the central territorial and security disputes. And so these talks have done nothing to resolve those differences. The issue, of course, remains the continuity of irreconcilable positions that has defined negotiations since the start of the war. Ukraine maintains that sovereignty and territorial integrity are non-negotiable, and that any ceasefire without withdrawal will only entrench aggression. Russia maintains that territorial changes and security demands are facts to be recognized, not bargaining chips to be reversed, despite the fact that it has failed to advance to the territories it is demanding as a starting point to full peace negotiations, and um, we are seeing no change in its posture. There is a very narrow zone for limited arrangements, including prisoner swaps of the sort we saw recently, grain transit understandings, and deconfliction mechanisms. So the UAE channel for now has focused heavily on those limited files because they're administratively implementable and politically defensible. But there has been no movement on ceasefire terms, territorial status, or security architecture. So the perception of stagnation continues to grow for that reason. And we're seeing that there is a genuine structural difficulty and not just some sort of a procedural crisis. Now, President Zelensky claimed earlier that the security agreement with the US is ready for presentation, but we have not yet seen this announcement so far. Uh, Meanwhile, President Trump introduced a June deadline, which puts pressure on both parties. He has repeatedly stated that he wants this war terminated rapidly. He emphasized leverage based approaches rather than open ended attrition, and he basically sided with Russia on where that leverage should lie. So he is signaling that June could be an internal US inflection point for the remnants or review of the remnants of military and intelligence aid, sanctions calibration, and diplomatic bandwidth. Now, US role has been diminishing for a while now, definitely since Trump's entry into office. But Washington is trying to put pressure on both sides to produce measurable diplomatic results within a defined time frame. He is under pressure, in other words, to produce a result for the domestic American audience before the midterm elections in November, and that is a significant concern for his part. And he is also altering expectations both inside Ukraine and among European partners. He has pressed for clearer articulations of war aims, financial sharing of burdens, and timelines for transition from combat intensity to negotiation. So this is just more pressure on these parties, creating a visible checkpoint to measure progress or stagnation. However, it does not necessarily imply immediate and 100% withdrawal of support. It creates additional conditionality in terms of its tone, in terms of the strategic communication. Mm, of course, all of that affects European commitments and defense planning, and the deadline to them is much more than just bilateral US Russia or US Ukraine axis. And it signals also to the question of coalition cohesion. But for Russia, um, they were they're seeing a different interpretation of these events. For Russia, this is an opportunity to calibrate its diplomatic tempo to divisions within Western alliances, as well as domestic political cycles abroad. So, seeing a firm US deadline um, reduces ambiguity about Washington's current timeline and helps Moscow decide whether what action, whether in terms of negotiations or kinetic action, serves its interests best. It can form its military and political strategy on the basis of Washington's deadline. And seeing that Trump is under pressure, This is signaling to Moscow that this could be time to escalate, and we are already hearing news of a potential new summer offensive, despite the fact that Russia's losses are now outpacing the rate at which it can replace those losses of personnel and even equipment as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Shukerman on our special series on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.